Okay, so in this lecture we talked about the endocrine system, which, along with the nervous system, basically controls all of the functions of the body. So the chemical messengers in the endocrine system are hormones, and hormones are special in that they are released into the blood, so they are dispersed basically throughout the body. Now, the endocrine glands that produce these hormones include things like the thyroid, parathyroid, pituitary, the adrenal glands. Those are kind of the main endocrine glands. And what I mean by main endocrine glands, basically their primary function is to produce hormones. Okay, but there are many other tissues that also produce hormones. So we have two broad classes of hormones. We have the amino acid based, also known as the protein hormones, and we have steroid hormones. And the steroid hormones are based on cholesterol, which is a lipid. So protein hormones are water soluble, and steroid hormones are lipid soluble because they're lipids. And this is really important because this is going to dictate how they interact with their target cells. So with this picture, on the left here, we have a water soluble hormone, which is basically going to be a protein hormone. This is something like insulin. And these are going to bind to receptors on the surface of cells. And that's going to activate a whole cascade inside the cell to eventually change gene expression. But the big takeaway here is that these hormones bind to receptors on the surface of the cell. Now, steroid hormones, they are also going to bind to receptors, but since they are lipids, they will move right through the lipid bilayer, and they'll bind to receptors inside the cell, intracellular receptors, and then they will directly alter gene expression. So it's really important to understand the difference between these two groups of hormones because of how they interact with target cells. So, like all functions in the body are regulated by feedback, most of them being negative feedback, and hormones are no different. So, most hormones are going to be regulated by negative feedback, and basically this is when an effect is counteracted. Okay, so acts to counteract the effect of its own influence. Okay, it basically is a reversal in a controlled condition. So the example we have here is the control of thyroid hormone. So TRH from the hypothalamus will stimulate the release of TSH from the anterior pituitary, which will stimulate the release of thyroid hormone from the thyroid gland. As the levels of circulating thyroid hormone increase, this is going to decrease the production of these hormones here. Okay, that's negative feedback. Now, a few hormones, most famously oxytocin, works by positive feedback, which encourages the effect of its own influence. Okay, it basically reinforces a change in a controlled condition. So as oxytocin is produced, this is going to cause contractions of the uterus, and those contractions will actually feed back and cause the production of more oxytocin. So the release of hormones, we know are going to be turned off by negative feedback, but something has to turn the production of hormones on. And there are really three main stimuli that can do that. You have humoral stimuli, and basically these stimuli are going to be things like ions or nutrients. Okay, for example, the release of aldosterone is going to be stimulated by decreased levels of sodium in the blood. Hormonal stimuli, this is when hormones are released in response to other hormones. And, we talk about this in depth with the relationship between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary, and then all of the organs that those anterior pituitary hormones stimulate. And then neural stimuli, this is when hormones are released in response to stimulation by nerves. The best example of this, and we didn't talk about this, but the adrenal medulla, which produces epinephrine and norepinephrine, which you can think of those as hormones, that's stimulated by sympathetic nerves. Okay, so let's talk about some of these glands, some of these relationships. So the pituitary gland, very important endocrine gland. It sits in the sphenoid bone. Again, I really don't care so much about that. That anatomy is not really important. It has two lobes, has a posterior pituitary and an anterior pituitary, and they actually come from different types of tissue, which is interesting during embryonic development. And the pituitary gland is connected to the hypothalamus by what's known as the stalk or the infundibulum. Again, that anatomy is really not that important. So the anterior pituitary, also known as the adenohypophysis, It's called that because it arises from glandular epithelial tissue. And its secretions are regulated by the hypothalamus, and we're going to talk about that relationship in a little bit. Now, the hypothalamus is going to secrete both releasing and inhibiting hormones to the anterior pituitary, and it releases these into the hypophyseal portal system. It's just the network of blood vessels that connects the anterior pituitary to the hypothalamus. There are 6 peptide hormones produced by the anterior pituitary. 4 of these are tropic hormones. Tropic hormones are hormones that regulate the release of hormones from other endocrine glands. So an example of this is something like adrenal corticotropic hormone, ACTH, which will go to the adrenal cortex and stimulate the release of cortisol. So here we can see the kind of the anatomical relationship between the hypothalamus, which is up here, and the pituitary gland, which is down here. So this is the infundibulum. This is the physical connection. This is the hypophyseal portal system. This is the network of blood vessels that connects basically the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. And we'll talk more about their specific relationships here in a second. So again, just to kind of reiterate here, the hypothalamus is going to produce hormones that stimulate secretions from the anterior pituitary. The relationship with the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary is different. So the hypothalamus will produce 2 hormones, okay, and those will be oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, and they will be sent to the posterior pituitary where they'll be stored and then released. The posterior pituitary doesn't produce really any of its own hormones. Okay, so again, hypothalamus produces oxytocin, antidiuretic hormone. Antidiuretic hormone is also known as vasopressin. These hormones will go from the hypothalamus to the posterior pituitary where they will be stored and released into the blood. So again, just showing this anatomy again. And now we're going to talk more about the relationship between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary, which is a little more complex. So we're going to go through each of these anterior pituitary hormones. The first one being growth hormone. Growth hormone is also known as somatotropin. Now, growth hormone, for the most part, actually doesn't exert its own effects directly. It works mostly indirectly using what are known as IGFs, insulin-like growth factors. Okay, so growth hormone is basically going to cause the production of these insulin-like growth factors, which will stimulate the growth and proliferation of cells. And the major targets of these IGFs is bone and muscle tissue, which makes sense. Now, growth hormone can act by itself, and it's going to be involved mostly with increasing metabolism of carbohydrates and a little bit with lipids. Now, growth hormone is, the release of growth hormone is stimulated by growth hormone releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, and it's turned off by growth hormone inhibiting hormone, also known as somatostatin. So a lot of hormones will have certain patterns, certain pulses at which they're secreted more throughout the 24-hour day. Growth hormone is going to be secreted mostly during adolescence, but in most cases it's going to be secreted mostly at night, which makes sense. That's when your body is recovering. So the next anterior pituitary hormone is TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, and it's going to stimulate the thyroid gland. Now, its release is regulated by thyrotropin releasing hormone, TRH, from the hypothalamus. The next one is ACTH, adrenal corticotropic hormone, and this is going to stimulate the adrenal cortex to release glucocorticoids, specifically cortisol. And the regulation of ACTH is by corticotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. So the next 2 are known as gonadotropins. The first one is follicle stimulating hormone, which is going to stimulate the production of the gametes, okay, the sex cells. It's also going to be involved with maturing the ovarian follicle, okay, in females. The next one is luteinizing hormone, which is going to stimulate the production of testosterone, mostly in males. It's also going to be involved with maturation of the ovarian follicle, and it also is the trigger for ovulation in females. Okay, so it's that luteinizing hormone surge that really triggers ovulation. Again, these hormones are known as gonadotropins, and their release is triggered by gonadotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. And then finally, prolactin. So prolactin is going to stimulate the production of milk from the mammary glands. Its release is going to be stimulated mostly by increases in estrogen, and it's actually inhibited by dopamine. And here's my seemingly confusing sort of summary, but this summary pretty much gives you most everything you need. So all of these up here, these are hormones coming from the hypothalamus, and these are the hormones from the anterior pituitary. So of course we have flat peg without the E. That those are all of your anterior pituitary hormones. And as we can see, I want you to know these relationships. I mostly care about the relationship here and the relationship here. Okay. So CRH from the hypothalamus stimulates the release of ACTH from the anterior pituitary. This will go to the adrenal cortex to stimulate the release of cortisol. Kind of the same exact thing over here. We have TRH, thyrotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, stimulates the release of TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary. This is going to go to the thyroid and stimulate the release of thyroid hormone. Okay, so again, the posterior pituitary comes from nervous tissue instead of that glandular epithelial tissue like the anterior pituitary. And again, it's just going to store antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin, which were produced by the hypothalamus, and then eventually release them into the blood. So let's talk about these hormones. Antidiuretic hormone, its main job is to promote conservation of water in the body. Okay, it's going to tell the collecting ducts in the nephron, or not the nephrons, in the kidneys. Collecting ducts aren't a part of the nephron, but it's going to tell the collecting duct to keep water in the body. And it's going to do this in response to osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus, basically sensing that there's too much stuff in the blood. There's not enough water. Now, in really high doses, antidiuretic hormone can cause vasoconstriction. That's why it's also known as vasopressin. And this down here about caffeine and alcohol, this is just kind of a fun fact. Both of these inhibit ADH to a degree, and therefore it's going to increase urine output. Oxytocin is going to stimulate contractions in the uterus during childbirth. Again, it operates by positive feedback. It's also important for the ejection of milk, which is also positive feedback. Suckling is going to increase the release of oxytocin. This is also kind of a fun fact down here. So oxytocin is released when people hug, so it's sometimes called the love or cuddle hormone. How sweet. Okay, the thyroid gland. Thyroid gland is, it sits distal to the larynx, and it kind of sits anterior and lateral to the trachea beneath that. Has two lobes, and it's connected by what's known as the isthmus, and has two main hormones, thyroid hormone and calcitonin. So thyroid hormone, TH, really encompasses two hormones, thyroxine and triiodothyronine. This triiodothyronine is really the active form of thyroid hormone. Okay, so most of this T4, which has 4 iodines, it's going to lose one of those iodines and then become T3. Now, this point about thyroglobulin and the follicular cells, I don't really care that you know that. It's not that important. Interesting little tidbit. Thyroid hormone is not a steroid or a peptide structurally, but it acts like a steroid at its target cells. So as far as the function, its main function is to increase overall metabolic rate. It affects mostly every cell in the body. It's going to increase body temperature. Those are the big ones I want you to be familiar with. Of course, the release is regulated by thyroid stimulating hormone, which is regulated by TRH from the hypothalamus. Now the next one, calcitonin. This is a peptide hormone, protein hormone, produced by parafollicular cells. I don't really care that you know that. But its main job is to lower blood calcium levels. Okay, and it does this by inhibiting the breakdown of bone. It's going to, which is resorption. It's stimulated and inhibited by just the concentration of calcium in the blood, which is a humoral stimulus. Now, I've talked about calcitonin not being very, very important. If you don't have calcitonin, and you have fully functional parathyroid hormone, your calcium levels will stay relatively stable. So the parathyroid glands, they sit on the posterior surface of the thyroid gland, and they are going to secrete parathyroid hormone, which is a protein hormone. So, like I said with calcitonin, calcitonin is not all that important for regulating calcium, but parathyroid hormone is very, very important, along with vitamin D. And basically, it's going to be released when calcium levels drop, okay? And when calcium levels drop, it's going to do a number of things, like it's going to stimulate the resorption, the breakdown of bone to increase calcium levels in the blood. It's going to stimulate activation of vitamin D, which is going to further increase calcium levels in the blood. So very, very important hormone. So a couple of pathologies, I only put them in here because the book doesn't really talk about them too much, but hyperparathyroidism, this is typically due to an adenoma, a tumor of the parathyroid glands, and basically what happens is the bones become soft, they deform because all that calcium is being, drawn out of the bones and into the blood, and you're going to have all those manifestations of hypercalcemia that you would expect. Hypoparathyroidism, this is typically due to accidental removal, or not accidental, maybe it was purposeful, or even trauma. Also magnesium deficiency, because magnesium is needed to secrete parathyroid hormone. But basically what happens is you have decreased levels of calcium in the blood, and you have all of those manifestations of hypocalcemia, such as increased neuromuscular excitability and all those other manifestations. So the adrenal glands, also known as the suprarenal glands, very important glands. They sit on the superior poles of the kidneys. They are roughly shaped like pyramids, and they have two main parts. They have the outer portion, the bark, which is the adrenal cortex. Cortex means bark, and the inner portion, which is the adrenal medulla. So here you can see, here's the right adrenal gland, left adrenal gland. This is the outer cortex, and this is the inner medulla. So the adrenal cortex, basically all of the hormones coming from the adrenal cortex are steroid hormones, and as a whole, they're called the corticosteroids because they're steroids from the cortex. And there are three layers of the adrenal cortex. From most superficial to deep, you have the zona glomerulosa, the zona fasciculata, and the zona reticularis, GFR. Okay. So the zona glomerulosa produces the mineralocorticoids. That's just that means aldosterone. Okay, salt. The zona fasciculata produces the glucocorticoids, like cortisol, sugar. And the zona reticularis is going to produce a small number of sex hormones, known as the gonadocorticoids, which we've already talked about some of the gonadotropins earlier, but it's a really small amount. So GFR, okay, the salt, sugar, and sex. Now, these are kind of just rough estimations. There's production of glucocorticoids in the glomerulosa and gonadocorticoids in the fasciculata, but just know these three points up here. So let's talk about the mineralocorticoids, which are going to basically regulate minerals, mostly sodium and potassium. And the big hormone is aldosterone. Okay. So aldosterone is going to target a couple of places in the nephron, including the distal tubules, also a bit at the loop. But it's going to stimulate the body to reabsorb sodium, keep sodium, and also get rid of potassium. Okay. And the secretion of aldosterone is going to be stimulated by decreased blood pressure and blood volume, or an increase in potassium concentration in the blood. So we know RAS at this point very, very well. I'm not going to ask about this on this upcoming exam, but it's something you should stay familiar with because you'll certainly see it on the final exam. Okay, so the glucocorticoids, mostly involved with energy metabolism, especially glucose. Okay, so along with things like insulin and glucagon, they help to keep glucose levels steady. They're also going to be secreted during times of stress, any stress, physical stress, emotional stress, infections, anything like that will cause the release of these glucocorticoids, most specifically cortisol. Cortisol is sometimes called the stress hormone. So let's talk about cortisol, also known as hydrocortisone. The release of cortisol is stimulated by ACTH, which we know is stimulated by CRH from the hypothalamus. Cortisol levels are highest in the morning because you've been fasting, so your body's been working to try to keep glucose levels steady. Now stress is going to interrupt this normal pattern of cortisol secretion. So what happens is, cortisol is going to be secreted throughout the day, which increases basically amounts of all the macromolecules in the blood, so glucose and fatty acids, amino acids from proteins. Cortisol also induces what's known as gluconeogenesis. Gluconeogenesis is basically producing glucose, new glucose, from fats and protein sources. Okay. Cortisol aids in sympathetic nervous system and vasoconstriction. I don't really care that you know that. Now, too much cortisol is very detrimental. Okay, and we're going to talk about Cushing syndrome, Cushing disease next week. But it's going to decrease your immune system, weakens the immune system, decreases inflammatory responses, which we know are actually quite important in a lot of cases. It's going to depress the formation of cartilage, which you need to make new bone. And I point this out just because steroid drugs are used so commonly and sometimes excessively. So I like to talk about too much cortisol. And again, we'll come back to this with Cushing syndrome. So the gonadocorticoids from the adrenal cortex, very, very small amount, and they're typically androgens, which are kind of the precursors to male sex hormones like testosterone. But there's also some estrogens. The big takeaway is it's a really small amount. The majority of the gonadocorticoids are going to be produced from the gonads. Okay. So androgen levels tend to rise during age 7 to 14, so it's associated with the onset of puberty, and that makes sense. Okay, the adrenal medulla, this is the central portion of the adrenal gland, and it's going to produce epinephrine and norepinephrine. Epinephrine and norepinephrine, they're hormones, they're neurotransmitters, they're kind of really interesting catecholamine molecules. And they're going to be released in response to stimulation by the sympathetic nervous system. Sympathetic nervous system basically sends nerves right to the adrenal medulla. So that's why it's so fast when you get scared. The effects are immediate. So epinephrine is released in greater amounts than norepinephrine. It's like 85 to 15 ratio, something like that. I don't really remember. But basically, they're just going to enhance or intensify the effects of the sympathetic nervous system. And obviously, epinephrine is used clinically, in cases of anaphylaxis and asthma. This point about the chromaffin cells, it's really not that important. And again, here you can see, here's a sympathetic neuron going straight to the adrenal medulla. Okay, so very, very fast. And as soon as this is stimulated, epinephrine, norepinephrine is going to be secreted right into the blood, and you're going to enhance those effects of the sympathetic nervous system. So the pineal gland is a very, very small structure in the diencephalon, and its main secretion is melatonin. Melatonin is associated with regulation of circadian rhythms, your 24-hour cycle, and it's released during times of low light. Okay, so here's the pineal gland back here. Here's just for a little reference, here's the hypothalamus, here's the pituitary. Okay, so the pancreas. The pancreas is unique. Very important organ because it contains both endocrine and exocrine glands. So these endocrine portions are these little clusters of cells known as the islets of Langerhans, also known as the pancreatic islets. So the islets contain two main cell types. They have another cell type, a delta cell. We're not going to talk about that. But alpha and beta cells are the big ones. Alpha cells produce glucagon, beta cells produce insulin. Okay? And what they do is they work antagonistically to help regulate blood glucose levels. So here's the pancreas. These are the islets of Langerhans. These are the endocrine bits of tissue. These are the exocrine bits of tissue, which are going to secrete digestive enzymes that will eventually go into the duodenum. So glucagon, polypeptide hormone, like I said, it's produced by alpha cells, and glucagon acts to increase blood glucose levels. Its main target is the liver because the liver stores glycogen. Glycogen is our storage form of glucose. Okay, so we take glucose and we store it as glycogen. So glucagon's going to target the liver, tell the liver, hey, break down some glycogen so we can increase glucose levels in the blood. It also stimulates gluconeogenesis, which is, again, that production of glucose from non-carbohydrate sources like amino acids and fatty acids. And it's going to be inhibited by increases in blood glucose levels, okay? But it's also going to be inhibited by insulin and growth hormone inhibiting hormone. That last one I don't care what you know about. So insulin, protein hormone, released by beta cells, and insulin mostly works to decrease blood glucose levels. It's going to be released mostly after you eat, but it's also released before you even start eating, and of course while you're eating. Its job is basically to be kind of like a key to cells. Okay, it's a protein hormone, so we know that it binds to the surface of the cell. So it's going to bind to the surface of the cell and basically tell that cell to open the door so glucose can come in. And insulin loves to do this on adipose tissue and also muscle. Insulin inhibits the breakdown of glycogen to glucose, because if we did that, that means we would be raising blood glucose, and we don't want to do that. Formation of glycogen is inhibited until the body's energy needs have been met. So that makes sense. If too much energy is available, it will basically be converted to fat. So if you have glucose floating around that you don't need right away, right now, you're going to basically put it in adipose tissue, and it's going to be converted to fat. So I had this little point about postprandial hypoglycemia. I think it's an amazing system. Nobody else really seemed to, but that's okay. I'm not going to test about it, but it is a really interesting thing. This is just showing kind of some of these, kind of the interplay between insulin and glucagon and how they're antagonistic. So the gonadal hormones, the sex hormones. So the gonads, the ovaries, and the testes are going to produce the majority of these sex hormones. We know that a very small amount are produced in the adrenal cortex, but the majority are produced by the gonads. And the release of these gonadal hormones is stimulated by those gonadotropins from the anterior pituitary, so LH and FSH. So the female ovaries are going to produce estrogens, which is kind of a family of hormones, and also progesterone. Estrogens, of course, are going to be important for the development of secondary sex characteristics, development of the reproductive organs. It's going to be important for release of prolactin. Progesterone and estrogens are both important for the menstrual cycle and the changes that take place, especially in the uterus. Now, the placenta also acts as a temporary endocrine organ during pregnancy, because it also produces things like progesterone and estrogens, and that actually influences the course of the pregnancy. Now, the testes primarily produce testosterone. Testosterone is going to drive the development of secondary sex characteristics, the maturation of the male reproductive organs. It's going to be important for the production of sperm, and of course it's also associated with sex drive. So just a last couple slides here showing that there are lots and lots of other organs in the body that produce hormones that we don't think of as endocrine organs, because they're really not, but they still produce hormones. So the heart, for example, produces natriuretic peptides, which basically inhibit aldosterone. And the GI tract produces lots and lots of hormones, things like ghrelin. Ghrelin's a hunger hormone. Other ones I think I mentioned, like secretin, cholecystokinin, are important during digestion. The kidneys, we know, produce renin, but they also produce erythropoietin, which is a hormone that stimulates the production of red blood cells. So again, the kidneys produce renin. The skin produces inactive forms of vitamin D. So vitamin D3, which is known as cholecalciferol, is stimulated from UV light in the skin. Vitamin D is going to be finally activated in the kidneys to its active form, which is calcitriol. Adipose tissue actually produces a hormone known as leptin. Leptin will go to the hypothalamus and try to tell the hypothalamus that, hey, I'm full, I don't need any more food. Okay, so it's antagonistic to ghrelin. And then autocrines, paracrines, eicosanoids. We've talked about autocrines, paracrines before. Autocrines, these are chemical messengers that act on the same cell that produce the chemical messenger. Really, they're mostly important in the immune system, Paracrines, they are going to affect nearby cells. And then the eicosanoids, these are produced by lots and lots of cells. These are things like inflammatory molecules like leukotrienes, prostaglandins. Again, I don't really care so much that you know this slide. I just kind of threw it in here. As always, if you have any questions, please let me know.